Okay, I put this slide in because I think it's something that we all share in agriculture, and people outside of agriculture don't really quite understand that um, our farms, our ranches are not just a business. It's not just a job. It's also a legacy, a legacy that we hope to pass on down to our heirs. In the hope that our farm, our ranch will bring not only not only prosperity, but happiness to our kids and our grandkids at some point in time. Problem is that so often we're financially unable to do that. This, I don't have to tell you folks that this is one of the most desperate times in agriculture that I can remember in my life. This is very similar to the mid 1980s as far as the amount of financial stress and emotional stress that farmers are going through. And so let's take a look at that profitability. What currently limits your profitability? As I go around and talk to farmers, say what could you fix if you could fix one thing? You know what the number one thing they say? It's if only we could get decent prices. That's what you got? I'm not saying you're wrong. I think we do have miserable commodity prices. But if you have a financial model that only works when commodity prices are high, I'm going to tell you something, you're in trouble. You are definitely in trouble. Do not put your financial success in the hands of the Chicago Board of Trade. Do not put it in the hands of the big meat packers. If you are only profitable when prices are high, you will fail when prices are low. The only way you can gain power over your financial future is to become a low cost producer. Because let's take a look at this. Now this is corn grain. And people say, oh, we got miserable corn prices. Well, if you look at it historically, we are in a very high time in corn prices, believe it or not. So why are corn farmers complaining when we're seeing really historically high prices? When I started farming in 2000, the year 2000, I sold my first corn crop for $1.75. I thought, man, if I could just get $3 a bushel for corn, everything would be great. I'd be rich if I could get $3 a bushel for corn. Now we're getting $3 a bushel for corn, and we're complaining about it. What has changed? And obviously, what has changed is the cost of our inputs. Even though we're selling for about almost twice what we were 20 years ago, we are experiencing far higher input costs than what we did 20 years ago. Now, we can either sit and complain about this. We can go to the bar and complain. Do you think the Chicago Board of Trade is going to listen to us, say, oh, geez, yeah, you're right. We just need to pay you guys more. Do you really think that's going to happen? If you do, keep going to the bar, keep going to the coffee shop, and complain about it. If you think that that's really a worthless endeavor and your energy and efforts are better spent on becoming a low-cost producer, keep listening. Okay, another, and this is a lot of the talks that I've done, like on cool season grasses, have really been targeted more towards the eastern part of Kansas. This talk is really targeted more towards the western part of Kansas, because it really is, in many ways, a tougher place to farm. And much of that is due to the lack of rainfall. Now, in the era of post World War II, when people had really cheap land that they were able to develop with irrigation from the Ogallala High Plains Aquifer, there was a lot of millionaires really created overnight. The problem with that, though, is that that water is now disappearing. If you take a look at this map, you can see the reds and the browns. That's where there are less than, the browns are where the irrigation water has really already run out. It is no longer economically feasible to pump water in the areas that are brown. Where it's red, we're looking at less than 25 years. And you look at the areas that are brown, the areas that are red, it's pretty scary. It's only the areas that are white or the areas that are yellow that have water security. So this should be a scary picture. This is, when you look at the infrastructure that we have built in Western Kansas around this aquifer and what happens to it when it goes away, it's frightening. So let's take a look at what are the holes in the financial bucket. What do we spend money on? I think one of the biggest holes in the bucket is machinery. This John Deere combine, I was at a trade show and they had one of these for sale. And I guess I misrepresented it here because I'll give you the price tag without the header, and it was $625,000. Here's another way of looking at that. That is 200,000 bushels of corn. Not that you have to raise, that's what you have to sell in order to buy one of these. How many years does it take you to raise 200,000 bushels of corn? Not gross. That's just the portion of your total production that you need in order to pay for one of these combines. Think about that. 1/5 of 1 million bushels that you have to sell free and clear, not used to pay any other expense, just for purchasing this combine. In an arid environment without irrigation, that is a scary, scary prospect. How many acres do you have to have in order to justify having a machine of this expense? And then, of course, when we put that grain on the combine, here's what leaves with every 900 bushels of corn: 810 pounds of nitrogen, 333 pounds of phosphate, some sulfur, some zinc, of course, some potassium and some other minerals. You add them all up, you're looking at roughly $500 worth of fertilizer. Now, the carbohydrates that were in that corn come from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, water that comes from rainfall, and so water and rainfall and carbon dioxide from the air made the rest of it. Those are we get for free every year. But all this stuff needs replaced, or we're mining our ground. How many dollars is 900 bushels worth? Well, if we're looking at a little over $3 a bushel, we're looking at roughly $3,000 right now. 1/6 roughly of the value of that truckload has to go to replacing the fertility that got shipped off. Now, another big hole in the bucket, and this is one that has really drastically increased in the last few years, and that is weed control. Because we have a number of weed species with wind-blown pollen that are becoming resistant to multiple modes of action on herbicides. Got kochia here, tumbleweed, Palmer amaranth, another one resistant to multiple modes of action. Very aggressive weeds produce hundreds of thousands of seeds per plant. You know, people are, I know people who have given up on no-till because of their inability to chemically control these two weed species. I think it's a horrible shame, and we'll talk about some different strategies. I went to a presentation put on by Kansas State Extension, and in their budget, they had, for a fallow period, $80 an acre for fallow weed control. For a 10-month fallow period, $80 an acre. 4 applications at $20 a piece. Holy cow. And the average wheat yields were 22 bushel. 22 bushel times $4 for a bushel of wheat is $88. And it took $80 of that 88 just to pay for fallow weed control. How scary is that? Now, the limiting factor in the high plains of Kansas, in fact, you could ask just about any farmer, but in particular, farmers in the high plains, limiting factor has always been moisture. What have we done about that? Now, I want to get this quote by Albert Einstein in here before I start talking about what we've done, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Another thing is there's no activity quite so useless as becoming more efficient at doing something you should not be doing anyway. And this is another way that I am fond of saying this is speed is a liability if you're running the wrong direction. I think in arid area agriculture, we have been going the wrong direction for a long time. And most of what we've done in the past 100 years is get more efficient at going the wrong direction. And I'll show you examples. And this is an example. What's wrong with this picture? I took this picture approximately a year ago in southwest Kansas. You will see there is a dust storm in the distance. You see powder dry soil that's just had wheat planted in it, where the wheat is sitting in powder. And to the left, from a rain, 1.1 inch of rain, 10 days before, they could not plant wheat there because there was standing water. What's wrong with this picture? We've got too much water to plant and too little water to sprout and dust blowing, all off the same field within a few feet of each other. Water, and where did that water in the puddle come from? Would you say this? It obviously came from uphill. How much slope is there in this field? 1%, 2%? And water ran off. Water ran off this slope, and it's not soaking into the ground. This soil is completely, absolutely dysfunctional. And it got that way because of what you see in the picture, tillage. Why anybody ever puts a tillage instrument into the soil in the high plains just baffles me. Do you not see the insanity of this? You tell me your limiting factor is moisture, and it is, and then you do something like tillage to your soil that makes it completely inefficient at receiving rainfall, infiltrating rainfall, storing rainfall, and allowing plants to root down and get that rainfall. It's ridiculous. And why did we go down? You know, why did we go down this route? It started with the Homestead Act. Homestead Act basically stipulated the Homestead Act was all about manifest destiny, and we're supposed to, we're supposed to plow the plains and grow grain. That was seen as our noble purpose on earth, was to destroy nature, replace nature with grain to feed the human race. That was seen as progress. That was seen as God, our duty to God. I don't know how we got such a perverted worldview, but that's what it was. And the Homestead Act said that you get 160 acres for free, but you got to plow it all up. Or you had to plow a certain minimum percentage of it. And what that led to was, and you had to raise grain for so many consecutive years. And what happened was that most of these pioneers, 80% of the pioneers, did not make it their first 10 years. They went bankrupt. They were starving. And they found out, just as we typically find out, that on the arid plains, you just cannot successfully grow grain crops consecutive years, one after the other. So what we did is we developed this little trick. Rather than change the system of grain, we tweaked it, became more efficient at going the wrong direction. Forgot I had this slide in here, but this explains why we had such difficulty producing grain in an arid area. See how the water use, this is the water use curve for wheat. You can see that as wheat begins to fill grain, it uses 2 inches of water a week. How often do we get 2 inches of rain a week reliably in western Kansas around the 1st of June? Basically almost never. 2019, about it in my lifetime that I can think of. When we do, spectacular things happen, but most of the time, the only way we can make this work is by having a lot of stored soil moisture. And we usually don't have that. So how did we create a trick in order to ensure that we had stored soil moisture? Well, we came up with this thing we called fallow. And fallow basically was, let's keep the ground tilled for a year, store all the moisture from that year, and add it on to next year's. And this is what we got because of fallow. Once we developed fallow as a practice and kept that ground tilled, we ended up with the Dust Bowl. And so we learned some lessons from the Dust Bowl. Not enough, obviously, because I was just out in western Kansas, panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma over this past weekend. And, I got in at night and I still had to wash all the soil out of my eyeballs every night from all the blowing dust. We developed something, initially, we started using the Noble blade, sweep plows that left the residue on top, which was an improvement for black fallow, where everything was turned over with a plow or a disc. And then we developed chem fallow. Now, chem fallow is the most moisture efficient form of fallow. But what You know, the purpose of fallow obviously is to store moisture. How good does it do it? Not as good as what you might expect. Black fallow, 10 to 17%, 20 to 30% no-till. That's it, folks. We store only about a quarter under best case scenario during the typical 10-month fallow between wheat harvest and corn planting, or corn harvest and wheat planting, or sorghum harvest and wheat planting. About 25% of the moisture that falls during that period. So here's how this fallow thing works. Let's say we get 20 inches of moisture a year. This would be like Colby, Kansas type moisture. Store 25% of that, or 5 inches, with fallow. And then we get another 20 inches the next year. Say, wow, this is amazing, because each additional inch of moisture, once you reach the threshold level, gives you about 10, 11 bushel of corn. Think, man, this is amazing. We changed 20 inches into 25. No, you didn't. No, you didn't. Think about it. What you did is you changed 40 inches into 25, because it took 2 years worth of moisture in order to do this. What was your limiting factor again? Who thinks that wasting 38% of your most limiting factor, having an agricultural system that routinely wastes 38% of your most limiting factor on a routine basis, is a good idea? It's insanity, people. And this is what we have been led to believe is normal. We have been led to believe that this is normal. Do you not understand why farming the way we do is such a tough go? I am not being critical of people that are farming in Western Kansas, but we have been all operating under a delusion that we are efficient. No, we are not. We are not. So some of this is going to be a very painful exercise to go through. And the first time I gave this talk, a very sparse audience, and I was very hesitant. I was very nervous when I gave this talk. I didn't know how it would be received. And when I finished, you could have heard a pin drop. Most people got up, walked out, didn't say a word. 2 elderly gentlemen came walking up to me, and their hands were shaking and their faces were red. And I thought, oh no, I have really insulted these guys. And one of them stuck out his hand and he said, I just wanted to thank you. Said, I have struggled all my life to make a living out here. And I always just assumed it was because I was lazy, or I was stupid, or I was a poor manager. And after listening to your talk, which made complete sense to me, I now see that I was fighting an uphill battle. And I wish that I had more time in my life to pursue the things that you're talking about. So let's get on with, what do we do different? What do we do different? Is this the way we've been farming? Is it the only way to do it? Okay, let's take a look at some different things. Okay, first of all, this is what has been normal. This was taken a year ago, blowing dust, tilled fallow, okay, and powder dry soil. Well, it's Western Kansas. What do you expect? Well, this is no-till wheat stubble taken across the road within minutes of the previous photo. Obviously, this is a better situation than the previous photo. We've got moisture, and moisture is everything in western Kansas. So this is a great system, right? No-till stubble. Or is it? What's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with this picture? People will sit there and struggle. I'll tell you what's wrong. There's moisture and there's sunlight. What are we doing with it? What are we doing with it? I mean, if you look at your goal in agriculture to produce grain, well, this is okay. If you look at it as your goal is to store moisture, okay, good job. But is that really your goal in agriculture? Your goal in agriculture, and I've hit on this many times, become a used sunlight salesman. Think about what you're doing as far as capturing as much sunlight as you can with green growing leaves and converting it into something useful. How good of a job is this system at capturing sunlight? Think about this. This moisture is not being made into money. The sunlight is not being made into money. It's being allowed to waste. This fallow system, think about this. Fallow is not a good idea. Okay, this 10-month fallow period, you get two things for free as a farmer: sunlight and rainfall. What percent of the rainfall are we wasting in this 10-month fallow period? 75%. What percent of the sunlight are we wasting in this fallow period? 100%. All agriculture systems are built upon the capture of sunlight and rainfall. Why do we have a system based upon wasting 100% of the sunlight and 75% of the moisture 20 months out of every 3 years? It's insane, people, because we have this tunnel vision that the only thing that farming should do is produce wheat and corn. So what about cover crops? How do cover crops work around here? And I get asked all the time, hey, do you think cover crops will ever work around here? And I said, well, define work around here. I said, oh, you're able to raise a good grain crop afterwards. Okay, let's take a look at this. Well, what cover crops do is they'll turn small amounts of moisture into mulch, organic matter, and feed. And the idea is to use moisture as it falls during those fallow periods. I'm talking about replacing fallow periods with cover crops. And so let me pose this to you. Do you want to use 100% of your fallow moisture, or do you want to use 25% of it? Do cover crops really use moisture? Yes, they do. Growing plants use moisture. Think about this. If you have to fallow in order to raise a grain crop, should you be growing grain crops at all? Now, before you form a mob or an angry mob of torches and pitchforks shows up at my door, you can farm however you want. But does it make sense? Does it make sense to farm the way you farm? Does it make economic sense? Does it make ecological sense? Does it make biological sense? Are you making efficient use? Are you mimicking nature, or are you spending insane amounts of money fighting nature? So what is your goal? Is your goal to grow grain whether or not you make money or not? Or are you trying to turn sunlight and rainfall into money the most efficient way you can? So let's take a look at this cover crop thing. Research trials, university, USDA. Spring planted cover crops will take one scenario, 1 to 3 tons per acre of biomass. Following wheat crops did from 13 bushel an acre less, 4 bushel better. On the average, you plant a spring cover crop, the following wheat yield in these trials did 7 bushel an acre less. Okay, so holy cow, that's horrible, isn't it? Isn't that awful? Why would you do that? And of course, you say, well, why would you spend money for a practice that reduces the yield of your following crop? And if these cover crops were never ever used for forage, I would agree. But I would ask you something else. In those same trials, the average wheat yield was 22 bushel. 22 bushel wheat. If you think about it, you plug that in. How many years out of the last 20 of 22 bushel wheat been profitable? Maybe the question isn't whether the cover crops belong in the rotation. Maybe the question should be, do the grain crops belong in the rotation? If you lose money every year, 20 years in a row on grain crops, why are you still doing grain crops? Remember Einstein's definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results? Maybe the Chicago Board of Trade will hear what I was complaining about how they're not paying us fairly, and they'll raise the price of wheat to $7. Don't hold your breath, folks. Let's take a look at, now let's examine this a little more. 1 to 3 tons an acre of biomass. What if you were to graze that? Okay, so let's look at replacing the fallow with a grazed cover crop. Okay, if you have the fallow period, let's say your typical 10-month fallow from July 1st to May 1st, every inch of rain that occurs during that fallow, remember, on the average, we're going to store 25% of it. So that 10-month fallow will have about 10 inches of rainfall. If you take, average amount of that fallow, we're going to get every inch of rain produces, every inch of stored soil moisture will produce about 10 bushel of corn. And out of that inch, we'll store about 25% of it. So at $3 corn, that inch of moisture, that inch of rainfall, 25% storage efficiency will give you about $7.50. What if we replace that fallow with a grazed cover crop instead? Let's say we just, instead of right after wheat harvest, instead of spraying and fallowing, we plant a crop of sorghum sudan. The moisture use efficiency of sorghum sudan in Kansas is about 800 pounds of biomass per inch of water. So when you graze 40% of that, that's assuming a 10-to-1 conversion ratio, takes about 10 pounds of forage to produce a pound of beef, and a pound of beef is worth $1. And remember, this is only grazing 40%. They're just stripping the leaves off, getting the goodies. The stalks are left on the ground for cover. That's worth about $32. Would you rather sell your inch of rainfall for $7.50, or would you rather sell it for $32? Think about that. And think about how much better your ground will be able to catch and store moisture with all those tons of sorghum stalks on the ground. But there's another benefit to this grazing deal, and that is the magic of manure. Manure makes soil happy. And let's just take some, I want to show you some research from Kansas State University. And you can look at all this stuff up top, but here's the bottom line. Where they applied manure that contained, they either applied fertilizer or manure that contained the same amount of total nitrogen. Look at the yellow arrow. Averaged over all their nitrogen rates. The fertilized fields did 24 bushel an acre. The manured fields did 55. This is, guys, this is 1 year. What's the effect long-term on productivity? That's the idea, people. When you have grazing in the crop rotation, every year you graze, the soil gets better. Manure makes a soil happy. The other thing that makes soil happy, we have grossly underestimated its value, and that is the value of root exudates. A simple fact of growing more plant material on that field because of the root exudates. Every day you're photosynthesizing, those plants are contributing root exudates to the soil microbiology. That's how you build soil organic matter, folks. What's soil organic matter good for? It's good for holding moisture. What's your limiting factor in western Kansas again? It's moisture. This is how you create a drought resilient field, people. There's some other things. This is a picture of a field I used to farm. And you see that circle there of somewhat healthy soybeans? And you see all the dead soybeans around it. This is a patch in the field. It's about a half an acre. pH 8.3. Horrible, horrible iron chlorosis. Why is there a healthy circle there? Folks, that's where I fed a bale of hay. That's where the animals turned all that bale of hay into manure. And you can see, I wouldn't call it a good yield of soybeans, but I'm getting a yield of soybeans, unlike all the other soil right around it. Manure makes soil better. Helps take care of moisture situations, helps take care of fertility situations, like this iron deficiency that you're seeing here on this very high pH ground. Now, I was at a talk one time and I was listening to a speaker from Eastern Colorado talk about his grazing system. And I heard a guy from White Cloud, Kansas stand up and tell this guy how easy he had it. Now, most people think that the easiest place to farm in the state of Kansas is probably White Cloud. And it is. It's got incredibly good soil. It's a little chunk of Iowa that got lost and ended up in Kansas. Good rainfall, unbelievably good soil. And from an outsider looking in, you say, man, it's easy there. You can grow all kinds of grass, and you can. But this guy stood up and said, you have it so easy out there where you are. And the speaker said, well, you're going to have to explain that to me. He said, that grass you have out there is good every month out of the year. You can grow it 1 year and graze it the next, and you don't lose any quality. He said, our grass, if we do not graze it within a few days of it having grown, it turns into sawdust, straw, bamboo stalks. We cannot store grass. Said, we have to be constantly outguessing the rain. Said, your way, you just have plenty of grass and you're good because you can store it out in the field. It doesn't deteriorate. It doesn't lignify. And I thought, wow, he's right. The unfair advantage. And I listened to a talk by Alan Nation, and he said, find your unfair advantage. What can you do that people in other places cannot? And buffalo grass and blue grama are very drought tolerant, warm season grasses that have a very short growing period, but they can be grazed any time of year and still provide good nutrition. I don't know of many other places where you can do that. So how do you capitalize on this unfair advantage? And let's keep in mind some biological limitations to pasture. What does this graph tell you? You can see here that you can graze 10%, and this is the amount of root growth from 3 different types of grasses. This is Rhodes grass, a warm season. Here is smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass. Graze 10%, doesn't hurt the roots at all. 20% doesn't hurt the roots at all. 40% doesn't hurt the roots at all. But look, once you hit 50 or 60, you see, you cross this threshold and bad things happen. So where do you stock? And people say, oh, I stock here at 40. Okay, so if you're stocked to remove 40% leaf removal in an average year, what happens in a drought year? In a drought year, you might be removing this much down here. Then what happens? What happens to the next year? What happens if you have a drought for 2 consecutive years and you spent 1 year grazing at 80%? You see how you're courting disaster here? Now, here's another thing, biological reality of grazing is that warm season grasses are more susceptible to damage. What's the worst time to graze severely on this warm season grass? It's right here, late summer, in September, late August, September. Now, the other thing I want you to take note of here. So this is during the growing season, this is the worst time to defoliate. Here's the next worst. Here's one of the better times. After you hit your average first frost date, after October 1st until it greens up again, there is no harm at all to your roots. And CHO is shorthand for carbohydrate. No harm to carbohydrate storage if you graze after October 1st in the fall. So, when is it most efficient to graze? Well, let me back up here. When is it most efficient to graze these warm season grasses? Obviously, in this time period, May, June, July. When is the best time to rest it? Here, in late summer. And then again, you can graze it in the fall without hurting anything. So, this is a picture taken in 2012, one of the driest years in history, not the driest year in history. Was there enough rainfall to grow grass? And in this particular area had 7 inches of rain that year. That's desert, in case you wondered. You average 7 inches of rain every year for years. Your area is referred to as a desert. Less than 10 inches on an annual basis, desert. So, was there enough grass or rain to grow grass here? Yeah, obviously. What's all this stuff here? That's grass grown from 7 inches of rainfall. There's smooth brome, there's little blue stem. On the north side of the road here, there was 3-foot tall big blue stem and Indian grass. What's going on over here? This is what that looked like. What percent defoliation is that? How much, what percent ground cover is that? Would you say that's probably 80, 90% defoliation? Would you say that's less than 50% ground cover? Okay, so we're up here 80, 90% defoliation. What kind of root growth are we getting? We're down here, right? What kind of drought tolerance will this grass have next year? Well, I think you can probably tell. Virtually none. There won't be any roots there to grow with. You have taken a short-term drought and turned it into a long-term drought. The drought is occurring on this side of the fence because we have, and the problem is, and I think if you ask the person who manages this pasture, did you overgraze? They would say, yes, I did. You say, why did you do it? They would say, I had no choice. Why did you have no choice? I had nowhere else to go with them. It is so critical to have a plan B and a plan C. We'll talk about what some of those plan Bs and Cs can consist of. Now, here's something else. Now, from the road, this looks like a very well-grazed pasture. Gosh, there's good tall grass out there, but as you look close up, how much did this grass plant producing beef on this pasture? And what percent defoliation is this? What kind of root vigor will this plant, these plants right here, have next year? What kind of root depth? So this one did nothing. It'll be fine next year, but it did nothing this year. This plant will barely grow next year. And then when it's grazed next year, because this won't produce enough feed to sustain the stock, what do you do about it? So let's come up with some different plans. Okay. We are going to continue to, one is to continue to raise grain crops, but we're going to put in a cover crop that we graze as a partial fallow replacement. We'll call that plan the graze plus grain. Or let's just replace grain crops entirely. We've shown that raising grain in an arid environment requires a surplus of moisture that is very seldom there. So we're going to call the other one grazol. Everything grazed, grazol. So here's your grain plus graze crop rotation. So we're going to take our wheat, fallow, sorghum fallow rotation, but we're going to plant a winter-killed cover crop for grazing. As soon as the combine leaves the wheat field, boom, we're going to put a cover crop in there. And in the sorghum stubble, either right after harvest or in early spring, we're going to plant a cereal grain. So here's how it works. We got the native grass pasture over here, obviously, and we have a 3-year crop rotation. We've got 3 fields here. Let's say we start out with grain sorghum. We'll plant a spring cereal like oats or spring triticale, spring peas in the spring. We'll terminate that in June, and we'll follow by wheat in the fall. And then wheat in the spring. After wheat harvest, we plant our summer cover crop that winter kills. The following year, then we plant grain sorghum. So next year, this field here will be grain sorghum, and then the year after that, this will be grain sorghum. So this rotation just spins around. 3-year crop rotation. We divide our cropland into thirds so that we have an equal amount each year. Okay, everybody with me? So here's the grazing sequence. In January through March, these cows are on grain sorghum stalks, milo stalks, very good winter pasture. Most areas, they're tall enough, they stick up above most snowfalls. Okay. In April, they can graze these spring planted oats, or maybe it was a late fall planted rye or triticale crop. And then May, June, July, they graze this native grass. And then they go to the wheat stubble that has a summer cover crop in it. And then in October, remember, we can move back to the native grass pasture because you don't hurt it at that time by grazing. And here's the grazol crop rotation. Everything grazed or grazol. So on part of the cropland, we plant a non-heading forage sorghum, like a male sterile or a photoperiod sensitive. I like a male sterile personally. After we graze out winter cereals, we plant a sorghum sedan-based blend on the other half of the cropland. And in the fall, after we graze the sorghum sedan in the summer, we will plant a winter cereal in October, and that will provide spring grazing. So this is 3 crops in 2 years, 2-year crop rotation. So here's how it works. We have now the cereal combination I had here was rye and hairy vetch in spring, and we will graze that out in April, and we'll follow that by a planting of forage sorghum. And this is to be used for winter grazing. And this carries over to next year. We'll have forage sorghum stockpile in the winter, and then we will plant that to sorghum sedan in the summer. These 2 fields just rotate. So we'll graze the sorghum sedan off here in the summertime and then plant rye and vetch in the fall. So here is your grazing calendar. January and March, they're on this stockpiled forage sorghum. January, February, March, they winter on stockpiled forage sorghum. In April, they will graze this rye and vetch. May and June, they're on this native grass, your buffalo grass. Here, they're on sorghum sedan, July, August, September. And then October, November, December, they are here. Back to the native grass pasture where you don't hurt anything by grazing it in the fall. So, talked about drought. What do you do in a drought? The grass produces less and the cows eat the same amount. So here's what we've always done. You say, well, that won't work in a drought. Is what we're currently doing working in a drought? Because here's what we do. We keep the cattle in pastures until everything is eaten to the nub. When every blade is completely consumed, then we move them off. Now, when it rains, that's fine. But what happens when it doesn't rain? You panic. So you beat your pastures up, you graze them to nothing, which guarantees that they're going to take years to recover. And then once the pasture is completely gone, you either have to buy hay because you don't grow much in a drought year, or you sell your cattle on a drought market for pennies on the dollar because no one else can feed them either. How well does the old drought plan work? I think you know the answer to that. It doesn't. It doesn't. It has bankrupted many people. 1-year drought causes a multiple year problem. So let's take a different approach here. So here's the average one. In an average year, we graze cover crops and we graze pastures. And we grow crops on our crop ground. And in a dry year, though, we can graze corn as an emergency system, and we can graze, wheat. We can graze our wheat out. And, you know, sorghum or corn, either one can be grazed in an emergency, and doesn't need to be your own crops. Your grain farming neighbors need some revenue off a crop that won't make grain in the drought year. Let me ask you, will this corn crop make grain? Obviously not. I mean, that's not going to make any grain. But does it have value? As a pasture crop, absolutely it has value. You know where this cornfield was? It was right across the road from this. Those two photos within minutes of each other. Do you think that this guy and this guy could have come to an agreement? It could have made this guy a little bit of money and kept this guy's pastures in good condition in the worst year in history. How productive will this pasture be the next year and the next year and the next year? I mean, this is how we cause degradation of pastures, is by doing this. Once you do this once, the next year's guaranteed to be a disaster as well. And probably the year after and the year after. This leads to permanent degradation of pasture. Now, another drought management strategy that I think everybody in areas of uncertain rainfall should consider, an old cattleman is one of the sharpest guys I know, gave me this idea, and I'm like, why doesn't everybody do this? And that is to maintain half of your grazing capacity as stockers. The easiest way to do that is just to save your own yearlings back and run them for a second summer. And if a drought hits, you sell your stockers before it gets too serious, because the problem is we are emotionally attached to our cows. If you have to sell cows, you are forced to sell cows, that is a sad, sad day. So we delay doing that until it's way past the time we should have. If, however, when you sell stockers, selling stockers, that's the reason you have them. You have them to sell them. Now, you might have to sell them earlier than you'd planned, but you don't cry when you sell stockers. You celebrate. Even if you sell them a little early, that's still, and stockers hold their value in a drought. Cows don't, because stockers go to a feedlot. Cows go to pasture. What happens if there's no pasture? You know, feedlots always have grain because there's some place around the country that's producing grain. Pasture, though, is a local market. So I think you can understand what I'm getting at here. Now, but the biggest benefit, you know, the biggest hole in the bucket that has arisen recently is the herbicide-resistant weeds, kochia, palmer amaranth. And I had a couple young farmers come up to me, they're in their 20s, and they said, well, we're giving up on no-till. I go, why? We just can't control weeds. I said, what weeds do you have? Kochia, palmer amaranth. So, well, describe those weeds to me. Oh, these things, they grow huge, they live on nothing, they outcompete our crops, you know, nothing kills it, you know, and like, you know what else? If you take a look at this, here's alfalfa, 18% protein, but takes a lot of water to produce plant to plant. Sorghum, very water efficient, uses half the water as alfalfa, but is low in protein. And this is pigweed and kochia. Same protein as alfalfa, but similar or maybe even better water use efficiency than sorghum. They're miracle plants, people. And when you move to a grazing system rather than a grain system, pigweeds and kochia just become free diversity in your grazing mixture. They're excellent grazing plants. And if you are just producing grazing, not producing grain crops, there is no need to spend money controlling these species. Now, this is what the typical buffalo grass pasture, native grass pasture in western Kansas looks like. Do you see an issue here? What's this over here? This is the start of a gully. Okay, well, you guys tell me it never rains out there. How do you get gullies if it doesn't ever rain? This is a sign of excessive runoff. Problem isn't the amount of rain that you get or don't get. It's that you're not getting enough water into your soil. And when it's not going into your soil, it's running off. And so what's causing water to not go in your soil? It's having way too little. And the way we cure this is the way we cure this. Same solution to two problems. The problem here is we have moisture and we have sunlight. First of all, this is caused by too much defoliation, particularly in late summer. This is late summer, and we're wasting sunlight and wasting moisture because we don't have anything growing. So here's what you do. One practice, planting that wheat stubble to a forage crop for late summer pasture. Crops to the rescue. And grazing this in late summer allows your native grass to stockpile so that you have this in October instead of this. How many days of grazing are you going to get off this pasture in the fall? I guess none. I don't know how a cow could actually survive on that. How many days of grazing off this? That's a lot of feed, people. That's probably 2 tons the acre of feed. Remember, although it's not a good idea to take 100% of this, you can take 100% without hurting the grass itself. The reason you don't take 100% is because of what I'm going to show you here. The more mulch you have on the soil, the more infiltration of rainfall you're going to have, and the less evaporation you're going to have. Look at this, inches per hour. Now, let's just put this in pasture terms. Here is a little study they did in Nebraska way back in 1937, but grass, soil, and rainfall have not changed since 1937. Fairly sloping field, but that's what most pastures are. They're ground that was too sloping to plow. 3 inches rainfall in 90 minutes. So fairly intense rainfall, but it seems like we are getting fewer rains and more intense rains over time. So you take this excellent pasture here with 95% ground cover. Look at this, only about 10% runoff. This pasture with 50% ground cover. Remember that one I showed you from out there in western Kansas in 2012? 50% or less ground cover. And that's common, folks. I would say this is typical. This is status quo. Not only are we losing moisture, take a look at this soil loss. We're losing topsoil. That's alarming. This loss of water is alarming, but you know, it rains. Rain will come again. Lost soil is lost forever. Look at this, 70% runoff. So let's put this into perspective. This 3-inch rain here, 2.7 inches got in the soil. Here, 0.9 inches got in the soil. The same exact rainfall, but this pasture here got 3 times as much rainfall in the ground. That's unreal, people. When I say we create our own droughts, I mean it. We create our own drought. The best way to eliminate that drought is to always have pasture with ground covered. Should either be preferably by green growing leaves. If you can't have green growing leaves, at least have brown leaves that prevent sunlight and rainfall from striking bare soil. So to summarize here, we're in this thing to make money. And let's take a look at the holes in your bucket. These were the holes that we talked about at the very start. What are the things you're writing big checks for that are really not necessary? Well, machinery expense. What are we doing about the depreciation, the interest, the fuel, the repairs? Well, let's eliminate tillage, number one. And by moving away from grain production, we eliminate combine, we eliminate grain carts, we eliminate grain trucks, we eliminate augers, we eliminate bins, we eliminate drying grain. Think of all the equipment around a typical farm involved with just handling grain. $3 a bushel grain, and look at how many dollars of infrastructure it takes. Get rid of all this. Fertilizer. How can we eliminate fertilizer? Well, first of all, you can put some legumes in the mix so you're generating nitrogen. And when you are grazing, the minerals that go in the animal, 90% of them go right back out on the field as manure. We do not have this massive export of 50 cents for every bushel that we need to replace. So we're conserving fertility. And then herbicide, this is real easy. Eat those weeds instead of spraying them. They're seed that you do not have to pay the cover crop company or the seed company for. They're bonus ingredients in your grazing mix. So how does the dollars compare on this? So what I did is I just plugged in some variable costs and some assumptions here. And you can plug in, don't take these numbers as gospel. What I recommend you do is plug in your own numbers. Do these calculations for yourself, because I guarantee you these numbers will not accurately reflect anybody's operation. They're just an estimate that I put together, but I think they're a reasonable estimate. So here I have 4 acres in a wheat, fallow, sorghum rotation, and 4 acres of native. This is over a 3-year period because we got a 3-year crop rotation. And this is from 4 acres of grazol, and which is 2-year rotation, and plus your 4 acres of native in that 3 years. So 30 bushel of wheat, 70 bushel of sorghum, and 1 calf. This 4 acres of native, I'm assuming 12 acres per pair. So every 3 years of that rotation, you have a calf. 3-year gross, $2,200. 3 calves, 600 pounder times $1.50. That's, you can argue, like I said, you can argue any of these prices on any of this. So you got slightly higher gross where we are grazing everything. Variable expenses, we've got fertilizer for 4 years, phosphorus, burn down applications, crop herbicides, got to control weeds here, couple plantings, couple combinings, and you're feeding hay. I assumed on you're grazing the pasture for 6 months. You are grazing milo stalks for 2 in the fall, and you are feeding hay for 4. I just assumed 1 bale of hay per cow. So, and had the bale of hay at $40 and the feeding of that hay at another $40. You can pick any of these you want apart. That's fine. Plug in your own numbers. $790. So on the grazol, 1 burn down per year, no fertilizer, 3 planting trips in 2 years. And so cow expenses, $105 on that 4 acres. So when you put the gross minus the expenses and divide that by the 3 years, that 3 years, this is what I came up with for a net before land cost. So if you're renting that ground, I assume the pasture rent, pasture upkeep was the same on both scenarios. Because you have more cattle on the grazol, you would have higher cow cost, mineral cost, but the fencing cost is going to be the same. So this is basically about double the return, about double the net. And what this is that livestock become your market outlet for your pastures, your cover crops, and also your crops that produce no grain, and even the weeds that, this is probably the biggest plugging a hole in the bucket right here. You are getting rid of, you're converting the weeds into money instead of spending money to kill them. And your soil gets better and better every year you do this. Not only do your finances get better, but so does your soil, so does your infrastructure. I hope with this presentation, I've got your brain cranking and you're doing some thinking. And I hope I did not do this to your brain, but please send me an email. Like I said at the end of a lot of these, I do have a couple books that I have for sale. The Drought Resilient Farm, and a lot of the things I talk about in here are in that book. I have another book, Managing Pasture. And so if you're interested in the books, if you have some questions, just send me an email, dale@greencoverseed.com. So thank you very much. Thank you, Noah, for doing all the technical stuff at which I am hopelessly incompetent. So thank you very much. Look forward to hearing from you folks.
Thank you, Dale. We really appreciate it. That was well done, and as always, a wealth of knowledge. So, yep, like you said, if you've got questions, feel free to email those at dale@greencoverseed.com. With that, we do have our next webinar on Thursday, what is that, Dale? The 28th or the 27th?
Yeah, and that,
no,
that's not right. Yeah, it's this
24th.
24th.
Yep.
24th, Thursday, 7 o'clock. And we will be talking about grazing cover crops, using cover crops to create year-round grazing. And because, as we've talked a lot about economics, so much of our costs are wrapped up in hauling hay or silage to our cattle. So by providing year-round grazing, using cover crops, we can eliminate that expense. And I have friends who are in much tougher climates with precipitation-wise and winter-wise than what we are here in Kansas, who feed no hay, none. If they can do it there, we can do it here.
Yep, no excuses.
End that grazing season out, increase our animal performance, and dramatically reduce our cost of carrying those animals. So please join us Thursday at 7.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you all very much for watching. We'll
Thank
see
you,
you
Noah.
soon.
Thank you, everybody, for watching.